All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of the stress management lecture. Okay, so we just finished talking about the model where they would inoculate people with colds, and depending on their stress, they're more likely to get the colds. And let's move on. When we start thinking about how does stress affect the immune system, I do want us to think about this total mind-body part here. In some situations, there's an indirect way that stress can impact our bodies and our immune system, particularly if we engage in unhealthy coping behaviors. So an example would be drinking in excess, smoking, drugging, people who cut themselves, and as an example, that would be harm created because of the coping behaviors. We've also talked about how if a person gets so sleep deprived, their body can't heal themselves, and that's going to create havoc in their bodies medically for them. The direct effect would be more of if we're experiencing that fight or flight or freeze, that adrenaline response over and over and over and over again because of that sympathetic nervous system activity, that's going to take its toll on our bodies physically too, because if there's not that parasympathetic branch being dominant where the body is allowed to heal itself, then the body's going to start breaking itself down, and you're going to get a lot more of that catabolism than that anabolism. So in some ways it could be all of this neuroendocrine stuff that is going on. So we got total mind body stuff happening here. When we look at our culture and we look at the politics of stress, we find that women tend to report more stress than men do in the United States. We know that ethnic minorities report more stress in the United States than people with white privilege. And we're definitely seeing that right now going on with protests. We know that individuals who have lower socioeconomic status and less education tend to report more stress than people who have more education because they've got more knowledge, as well as higher SES have more resources. They have more income and they have more resources. But in a lot of situations here, it depends on if there's an individual, if they have a cultural fit. And we know that the worst kind of scenario is when you have a lot of responsibility and you have very low control in your life. And so one way of thinking about stress is that poverty and poor health becomes a very vicious cycle for a lot of individuals. So being in poverty, not having resources, not having health insurance, not having shelter, not having education where you've got the ability to get certain jobs, this becomes a very vicious cycle. And it's going to be really interesting to see. I think we're getting more and more and more health disparities as this pandemic goes on. So some of the politics of stress. And then if people have a job that's very high responsibility, so healthcare providers right now, particularly if they're on the front lines of the pandemic, firefighters, police officers, those are individuals that tend to experience a lot of stress in their jobs. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears and I'm going to focus on this thing called gender role stress. So in my research program over time, I've done a lot of research where we have compared males and females on a variety of different things. And so I'm going to focus here on gender, but I want you to know that there are bodies of research that say focus on race and stress, or individuals with non-heterosexual sexual orientations and stress. I want you to know that there are all these other bodies of research, but I'm just going to particularly focus on the gender role stuff because this is stuff that I've done in my own research lab over time. Okay, if we got into the DSM, and I know this is not a course in abnormal psych, but if we get into the DSM and we take a look at gender differences in the types of psychological disorders that men have more of, women have more of, you do see some gender differences. You do see some patterns. Males are more likely under severe psychological stress, and when they develop a psychological disorder, they're more likely to have problems with alcohol and drug abuse, more likely to have problems with impulse control disorders, more likely to have these weird sexual types of behaviors, sexual paraphilias, and then they're more likely to be diagnosed with things like ADHD and conduct disorder. If we had to summarize the types of disorders that men get more of, they tend to be externalizing disorders. Men are more likely to get a psychological disorder where they're acting out in some way. Females, on the other hand, if we look in the DSM, we look at prevalence, are more likely to have depression and anxiety disorders, more likely to have eating disorders, more likely to have those somatization where it shows up in their body, like we talked about in those 6 pathways. If we had to generalize, women are more likely to have what we call internalizing disorders. The psychological distress takes its toll within them. So less acting out like the guys and more internalizing. Okay, so gender differences in psychological disorders. And if we ask why, there's a lot going on here. We've got the total mind-body stuff happening. We've got biological differences. And just as a simple example, estrogen for women tends to make us very nurturing and empathic. Testosterone, which men have more of, women have testosterone too, but they have more estrogen than men do. Testosterone for men, particularly young men, is very energizing. And so it makes a lot of sense that men hyped up on testosterone under psychological distress would be acting out, like acting out in anger, as an example. So we've got the biological differences going on. Men and women tend to be socialized differently. As an example, it is acceptable for women to cry when they are distressed. It is less acceptable in our society for boys and men to cry when they are under distress. I find it interesting in sporting events, which aren't happening right now, but when men get injured and oftentimes teammates put a towel over their head. Do y'all know what I'm talking about? So like they're on the ground and they're injured and they put the towel over their head. It's usually because they're crying. They're in so much pain that they're crying, and then a teammate comes along and kind of covers that up so that that's not visible to the crowd, that they're crying in pain. So it'd be a way of acknowledging that. Let's see here. Males and females do tend to present a little differently. It has been my experience as a therapist over time that when women come to see me, they just come to see me. I have found it over time, it's kind of interesting that when guys come to see me, it is usually because they have a friend or a parent or a significant other in either bringing them to see me or encouraging them to come and see a therapist. So guys are a little more reluctant to kind of share their distress, and women are a little more likely to just kind of do that. Okay, so we know that pre-pandemic cardiovascular disease, particularly coronary heart disease, is the, all right, let me save, my file's burning. Let me save it here real quick. And sorry, I know y'all can't see this, but it creates a file and I don't want to delete it because I want to save what I have burned here. Okay, so coronary heart disease, #1 cause of death for men and women pre-pandemic. And I want us just to think about what happens with guys. Guys develop cardiovascular disease earlier than women. Women are protected up until menopause from this. And I want us just to kind of think about, imagine this is an artery that feeds the heart. So it's a coronary artery. And I want you to imagine this reaction that takes place over time in the buildup of this atherosclerosis, this buildup of this plaque. So imagine if this guy, he's out there in the world, he's being macho, and he has this primary appraisal of stress, and he's a hot reactor, and he gets this huge surge of blood pressure in this coronary artery that creates this injury right here. And then you're going to get the immune system response. You're going to get this fibrinolysis is going to lay down this scab inside the artery. And then let's say he eats a milkshake and a cheeseburger, and you get this cholesterol that comes in and starts sticking here. And then what's going to happen over time, if this reaction in blood pressure and this attempted healing response inside the artery, if this gets clogged enough, he's going to have a heart attack and he might die from that heart attack. But does that make sense that the stress appraisal is going to create a blood pressure reaction, and then this process is going to build up over time and progress the cardiovascular disease? Does that make some sense? Okay. So I was involved in a research team years ago where they were very interested in understanding are some men more likely in the way that they perceive stress to be these hot reactors and react in their cardiovascular reactivity compared to some men that are just really chill and don't have a lot of stress, and they're not hot reactors, so they don't develop that cardiovascular disease? And so the team that I was working on, they ended up developing a scale called the Masculine Gender Role Stress Scale, or MGRS. And what they did to develop the scale, they interviewed a bunch of men and just interviewed them and said, tell me about the things in your life that you consider to be very stressful. And from those interviews, they started collecting test items and writing down these test items. And then eventually, after they had this big, long scale with all these different particular items, then they had a bunch of men and women college students take this scale and rate for every test item. If this happened to you, how stressful on this Likert continuum, very stressful, not stressful at all on this Likert, how stressful would this particular event be for you? And then they took for every test item, they took the females and they took the males. And if these test items were equally stressful between males and females, they got rid of the test item. For each of these test items, if they had the female scores and the male scores, and the male were significantly higher, if this event happened to them, they rated it as significantly more stressful, they kept that test item. Because what they wanted were events that men found to be stressful, but women did not find them to be stressful for a masculine stress scale. Okay. Then what they did is now the number of items on this scale has shrunk, because now they're only keeping the items that men find to be really stressful, but women don't. Then they take all these test items, they give them back out to a bunch of male college students, and then they run this thing called a factor analysis. And what the factor analysis does is it tells you what test items cluster together in a factor, what test items are related to one another. And after you do this factor analysis, you're going to have test items that fall off of the scale also, because they're not clustering with anything else. So the scale gets shorter and shorter. And what they found in developing the masculine gender role stress scale is that there were 5 factors or 5 clusters, and these are the different factors. So the first factor on the MGRS scale for men, and what I've done here is this is the name of the factor, and then this is just one particular test item that fell underneath it. But keep in mind, there's a bunch of test items that fall under each of these. I'm just giving you one example. So the first factor for the guys that was stressful, physical inadequacy. Okay. And an example test item here is feeling you're not in good physical condition. Okay. One of the reasons that we believe that sports evolved in human ancestry is that it gave men the ability to compete with one another and prove their physical prowess. Okay, which is part of the reason why a lot of straight women find themselves attracted to male athletes, as an example. Okay, so physical inadequacy for men. Questions here? Second factor on the MGRS scale, emotional inexpressivity. So an example here you do see women oftentimes telling one another, that hurt my feelings, but you don't tend to see guys say that hurt my feelings. What you tend to see in guys would be anger. So instead of expressing they're hurt by something, being angry at somebody as a way of venting that emotion. Okay. The third factor, subordination to women. My bet is there's probably a generational effect that is happening where many of you guys in here, as an example, if you had a female boss in your work, would be just fine with that. But generationally, like I think about my father, there is no way he would have survived a female boss in his line of work. And just as an example, for my parents, my mom has a better driving history than my dad's driving history. I have never in my entire life seen my mom drive my dad somewhere. Only he drives when they go somewhere together. So that's sort of that generational kind of thing. Does that make some sense? Yeah. Okay. The fourth factor on the MGRS scale, intellectual inferiority. Men like to come across as being very intelligent, even to the point where sometimes men will argue about their opinions almost as if they're facts. My favorite item on this scale is, in the old days before GPS, you all, we really did, when we had maps, we had these big maps in our cars because we didn't have GPS. And if you needed to find directions, you would go to a gas station and you would ask the people at a gas station, the gas attendant or the person selling the stuff inside the convenience store, you would ask for directions. That's how we learned how to get to where we were going. So long story short, this is an ex of mine, so I'm not going to name any names, but an ex of mine and I, we were once upon a time trying to find family in Texas. And we kept going down these dirt roads that had these ends to them. And we had seen a gas station a while back, and it was one of those things where I know he's getting frustrated, and we come to this dead end. We still haven't found the family member's house. And I turn to him and I say, how about we go back to the gas station and ask for directions? I think we're lost. And he got so angry at me. He was frustrated, obviously, got so angry at me. And the response was, we are not lost. We are right here. We are not lost. We are here. And it was one of those kind of like, okay, yeah, we are here. We're here, but here's not, I'm thinking, I'm quiet at this point because he's just so angry. And I'm like, but here is not where we wish to be, right? It's like, how do you argue with that? Yeah. Anyways. Okay. So enough picking on exes. The final factor on the MGRS scale, performance failure. So an example here, being unemployed when you wish to be unemployed, that's stressful for women, but especially stressful for men who find their identity in their work. Women are a lot more likely to find their identity with their relationships as well as their work. Men are a lot more likely to find their identity with their work. This is an example for heterosexual couples here. And an example would be for a heterosexual male having his lover say that she's not sexually satisfied in bed. And women, many women know this because there's this thing that women do. If somebody would please speak up and say this. What is this thing that women sometimes do in bed that I wish they wouldn't do because I think it's poor communication? But some women, anybody want to say it?
They fake an orgasm.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, they fake it. Yeah, they fake it to please their male partner. But I think it's poor communication because she's not getting pleased. And so I find that to be an unfortunate falsehood.
That's tragic.
Huh?
I said that's tragic.
Oh, I know. Yeah, it is tragic. Good sex for everybody. So this would be the performance failure piece. So does this make sense that these things would be more stressful for guys than they are for gals? Yeah, okay. All right, in this particular study, so now they've got this paper and pencil measure, and what they wanted in mind-body research, what they wanted to see is if they could give this scale out to a bunch of men and bring back only the men that scored really, really high on the scale and the men that scored really low on the scale. So this would be the experiment where they bring back high versus low MGRS men. And then they did this thing called a cold presser challenge. Dr. Mary Ballard has done some of this in her lab, where they bring these men in, they sit them in this chair, they wire them for heart rate and blood pressure, and then they have them take their hand and put their hand in a bucket of ice cold water. And that's called the cold presser challenge. And it hurts, you all. It's painful, it hurts. And ethically, there's a certain amount of time that you're allowed to leave them have their hand in the bucket without damaging their circulatory system in any way. So ethically, it hurts. It's a way of administering pain in an experiment. And so what they did, they bring these guys in, they're high and low, and they either put them through a cold presser challenge that was neutral. And in the neutral example, once they were wired and it was time to put their hand in the bucket, they would say, put your hand in this bucket of ice water, keep it in for as long as you can. And they would have the guys, put their arm in. In the other experimental condition, so we got a 2x2 design here, They did the same thing with the cold presser, but they gave them masculine instructions. So they would say, I want you to put your arm in this bucket of ice cold water. We know from previous research that men who are in better physical condition can keep their arm in significantly longer than men who are wimpy, something like that, okay? And then they've got these dudes that are in there like, whoa, keep it in there for, forever. Like, oh, yeah, I want to prove that I'm in great physical condition here. And they looked at their blood pressure. This is a really, really old slide, but I just want to show you here that this is systolic blood pressure. This is where the men were kind of resting down here. The high MGRS men were the men in the masculine challenge, spiked the highest blood pressure relative to the men in the other groups. So the beauty of this as mind-body research is that they were able to take this paper and pencil measure and predict which of these men would have the most cardiovascular reactivity in a masculine stressor relative to the low MGRS men are men who are in a neutral stressor. Does that make some sense? It's nice when you can do that, when paper and pencil can predict physiology. Okay. So I'm going to switch gears now. So on this research team, there were two women, me and Betsy Gillespie. She's featured here as first author. And then all the professors and all of the other students on this research team are men. And we were very interested in developing the female counterpart, so the female gender role stress scale. And so we did exactly the same thing. We interviewed a bunch of women and we said, tell us about the things that are really stressful in your lives. And we developed these test items. We gave the test items out to a bunch of men and women. We only kept the test items that were significantly more stressful for the women, got rid of the test items that were equally stressful. And then we did the same thing. We gave the scales now shrunk and we gave the scale to a bunch of women and we ran a factor analysis. And lo and behold, it came out with 5 factors again. So
I had a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
In these scales, was it better for people to be low in these stressors or high in these stressors?
You just had variance. So you had some people that were saying, "Oh my gosh, this would be stressful. This would be stressful. This would be stressful," and some people saying, no big deal." Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
For me, yeah. But the main thing was that keeping the gender difference, that only the items that were more stressful for the women, to make it feminine stressors. Yeah. Okay. So we got 5 factors, and they're a little different than the men. So the first factor we ended up naming emotional detachment. So an example here, having others believe that you're emotionally cold. We have a name for her. Can somebody shout out the name? So you got this woman, she's just really cold-hearted. We call her we're adults here. Huh?
I was going to say a negative Nancy.
Get harsher than that, Carson.
I was going to say a bitch.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, we call her a bitch. And somewhere in here, you're going to see women walk this bitch line a lot. There was a former psychologist, her name's Dr. Joyce Brothers, and I remember hearing about this book when I was a teenager growing up, and it kind of hit home to me. But it was called, If You Get Called a Bitch, Say Thank You. And it was sort of like empowering women that obviously if they got called a bitch, they were probably doing something that was threatening somebody, but they were doing something effective. So walking that bitch line is something that we women have to be careful about. Okay, the second factor, I was really interested in one of my lines of research. I do body image, eating disorders, obesity, fat talk. I was really interested back in the day of, could women who develop eating disorders be especially sensitive to feminine stressors? Okay. So when this factor showed up, I got really excited. It was like, so this was the second strongest factor on the scale. And we ended up naming it physical unattractiveness. But I still remember the research team meeting. So there's me and Betsy, and there's all these dudes. And we get our data, we've got the factor analysis, and we're sitting around and we're looking at this. And we arrive at this example item under here, wearing a bathing suit in public. And it was just such a fascinating gender thing that happened on the team that day. The guys are like, they're shaking their heads. They're kind of like, what do you mean? Like, wearing a bathing suit when, like in the grocery store, like wearing a bathing suit when you go to the post office. And Betsy and I were like, no, 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 people, like in a place where a bathing suit is appropriate, like you're at the beach or you're at the pool. But a lot of women, particularly if they've got body image issues, they're walking around thinking, I'm half naked, I'm half naked, I'm half naked, I'm half naked. People are looking at me, I'm half, you know, it's that kind of like self-consciousness that women tend to have in their body image that men tend not to have. And Betsy and I were kind of like understanding it, and the guys were just like, not. They weren't getting it. Okay, so that's factor 1 and factor 2. Factor 3, fear of victimization. I gotta get the keys out here because I gotta show you something. This is a little bit more of a realistic factor for women because women are a lot more likely to be victims of interpersonal violence than men. So an example item here, moving to a new city or a town alone. And I want to show you this here. Gals, do y'all know what this is? I got my keys here. Guys, do you know what this is?
Oh, yeah.
You do? Okay.
Yeah.
You do this? Do you walk in parking lots and have your keys like this? Some of the gals
No,
probably
not
do.
normally.
Not normally. Okay. Okay. So I saw a stand-up comic at one point in time, and she and her boyfriend are. It's nighttime. It's dark. They're walking in a parking lot. They're going to her car, and she gets her keys out, and she's walking with her keys like this. And her boyfriend is like, dude, what are you doing? And she's like, this is my weapon. And he's not getting it. She's like, and he's like, do you always do this? And she's like, yeah, I always walk to my car with my keys like this. And he's not getting it. He's not getting it. And she finally says to him, dude, I travel with a vagina. Meaning, right? Meaning, like, I could be raped. So I've got my, you know, my tool here that I could take somebody out if they tried to hurt me. Okay. I attended a very interesting workshop on interpersonal violence a couple of years ago, and it was fascinating to me. They asked the women in the audience, and they had this whiteboard. The facilitator said, ladies in the audience, tell me things that you do every day to not get raped. And the women were like, boom, 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 and the whiteboard's full. And then they asked the guys, tell me the things that you do on a daily basis to not get raped. And it was like crickets. Like, nobody's got anything. And it was just a fascinating exercise in the realization of the possibility of victimization like that. Okay, so I'll tell you my story. So I was out one summer riding my bike out in Sugar Grove without my girlfriends. Normally we ride together, but I was just out there training by myself one day. And I'm going around these really windy curves, and I could tell that there's a car behind me. So I'm going around the windy curves. I'm waiting to get around where I can see that there's no oncoming traffic, and I'm going to wave that vehicle around. Okay, that's just biking etiquette. So I'm winding. I could tell there's a car back there. I finally get to a clearing. I wave the guy on. He's like in a Skyline Sky Best truck. He was being very polite to me as a cyclist. He gives me plenty of room and comes around, and I'm like, well, that was very nice of him. Before I know it, there's this car up on me, and I didn't have the wits about me to think just stop and pull up. And he's crowding me, and there's a guy, he's got his window down, and he's crowding me over. I'm like, you know, right on the line on my bike, and he's screaming at me. He's yelling at me, and he's like, some of us here gotta get to work, and some of us here pay taxes for these roads. And I'm like thinking evil thoughts at that point in time, and I'm kind of going, you know, I think my bike is worth more than your car. I bet you I pay more taxes. And, you know, I'm thinking evil thoughts, right? You know, like I'm arguing with him in my head, thinking, yeah, I probably pay more taxes than you do. And he's screaming. And then he finally lets loose, and he finally just kind of goes on. And at that point, I'm shaking. Like, I am so upset at what just happened. And I get out in the middle of the road, and I'm doing this to him. So I'm riding my bike, and I'm in the middle of the road, and I'm doing this. And then he sees it, and he pulls over. Okay? He pulls over. And then I think about, very quickly, my friend Jimmy. My friend Jimmy angered, as a cyclist, he angered somebody. The guy pulled over, and right when Jimmy came up beside the car, he opened his car door and he flipped him. So I'm thinking at that point in time, like, you know, I'm out there in the middle of the road and he pulls over. And at that point, I'm like, and I too travel with a vagina. And I just turned around and went the other direction and he left me alone. But it was a lesson I learned over time to not get angry and to not, you know, who knew, he may have had a gun in his car. And so I've learned not to do that when I get upset when I'm out cycling anymore. Okay. The fourth factor on the FGRS scale, unassertiveness. Example item here, making sure you're not taken advantage of when buying a car. When men are assertive, they are just considered to be strong. When women are assertive, they are oftentimes considered to be what? Again.
A bitch.
Yeah, a bitch. Again, we're walking the bitch line here again. And I got some news for you women in this class. You all know about the white women make 80 to 81 cents for every white male dollar and doing the same job. Y'all know about that? Women of color make about 60 cents for every white male dollar out there. Some of that discrepancy, which is horrible, is blatant discrimination. But some of that discrepancy is women don't negotiate their salaries like guys negotiate their salaries. Okay? It would behoove us to start asking. We're always afraid, like, oh, I'm going to appear like I'm not nice if I negotiate. Negotiate. Whatever job you're on, negotiate your salary, negotiate raises. She was a former president of the American Psychological Association. And when she took her first academic job, she told this story when I was at a workshop with her. She got a job offer and she went and looked up at her med school and her university salaries for the women and the men. And she was able to take back information back to the person who was hiring her and offer her initial salary. She negotiated $40,000 more in her salary for her entry-level job just because she looked up the data and she went and asked for it. She negotiated it. And imagine if your starting salary, if you start lower than you deserve and it's always compounding over time, and then you expect that every time you get a promotion, you get a raise. Everybody, you guys get out there and negotiate, you gals get out there and negotiate. It can make a huge difference in your income over time. Got it? Yeah. Okay. Last one on the scale, failed nurturance. So I'll let you all absorb the poor little mama duck. Mama duck's having a bad day, and these little baby ducklings are having a bad day there. That's sad. So we ended up calling this one failed nurturance. And again, this idea like your child is disliked by his or her peers, it must be mom's fault. Mom must not be warm and loving, and then therefore their kids aren't liked by their friends. Okay. A little bit of the bitch line here on this one. Okay, so we wanted to do the same thing. Remember, I had an interest in eating disorders and body image back when we did this. And so I wanted to do the same kind of experiment. And I played around. I wasted a summer of my life pilot testing the cold bucket, the cold pressor test with a bunch of women. I brought all kinds of women into my lab. I sat them in the recliner chair. I wired them for heart rate, blood pressure. And I played around with all kinds of BS types of instructions with their arms in the bucket of ice water. I even said stupid things like women who are in better physical shape or women who have less body fat can keep their arm in significantly longer. And what I kept running into, and keep in mind, it's me, it's a female doing this to these women. They kept pulling their arms out. They were like, ow, that hurts. You're mean, bitch, you know, that kind of thing at me. And I just, no matter what I tried, it wasn't working. So then we decided that we would create this exam. We would create this like primary care health exam. And we would tell women in the feminine condition that, and we had this very handsome male researcher who was running the experiments with these women. He, in the feminine challenge condition, he told her that he was going to be measuring her body fat. And he did things like take a thing and press her triceps, and he took some measurements from her and that kind of thing. And then he told her after they did that experiment, he was going to weigh her. He really did not calculate her body fat. He just simulated it. And then in the medical exam, the control exam, We made sure that he touched the participants appropriately. He touched them exactly the same in the feminine challenge and in the medical exam. Okay, because you wouldn't want different levels of appropriate touch, because that could be affecting somebody's blood pressure or heart rate. So she was just told that they were having body fat measured, and we looked at their heart rate and their systolic blood pressure. And lo and behold, we found the women who were very high in FGRS. These are the women who are thinking they're getting their body fat assessed. This is their heart rate, much higher than the low FGRS women are the women in the controlled medical exam. Keep in mind that men react with blood pressure. Women react with heart rate up until menopause. So estrogen tends to control our blood pressure. So we're more likely, when women get stressed, we're more likely to react high heart rate. Guys are more likely to react with systolic blood pressure. Okay, so again, same kind of thing, beautiful. We've got this paper and pencil test that was able to predict cardiovascular reactivity in a lab setting, and the high FGRS women were more reactive. We did a follow-up study after this where we used the FGRS scale and we tested college women, and then we got access to collecting data on psychiatric patients who were hospitalized, and we had women with psychological diagnoses like depression or anxiety disorders. Those women scored significantly higher on the FGRS scale than the college students. But then we had data collected from women who were hospitalized for an eating disorder, which in my mind is a particularly feminine type of disorder. The women who had the eating disorder scored significantly higher on the FGRS scale than the women who were hospitalized for other psychological disorders, depression, anxiety, that kind of stuff. They were significantly higher than the college students. Okay, so we got some validity there. And when I do treatment for eating disorders, I follow not only cognitive behavioral therapy or acceptance commitment therapy, but I have a feminist lens that I view in working with my clients. And that feminist lens kind of helps deal with some of this feminine gender role stress stuff. Okay. So in terms of stress management, we've already talked a bit about this, altering the perception, doing CBT or ACT, bolstering the coping responses, doing behavioral therapy. We're trying to help people eliminate unhealthy coping responses. That's going to be behavioral therapy. And then buffering the body. And so this is all the stuff that you've read in the Walsh TLCs, getting people exercising on a regular basis, doing meditation, yoga, diaphragmatic breathing. I'm going to load a clip on As You Learn of me. It's a little recording of me, and feel free to watch it. Feel free to use it for yourself personally in the future if you want, but it's going to be me leading you through diaphragmatic breathing, leading you through some imagery for relaxation, some progressive muscle relaxation where you tense muscles, relax, breathe. So just watch the clip and follow along and see if you like any of the stress management stuff. And then if you want to use it in the future for your own stress management, feel free. So I'll load that up on As You Learn here in a few minutes after I load these recordings. All of this stuff here, you're training people to turn on deliberately parasympathetic branch, which is by default going to turn off the sympathetic branch, and can be very valuable for helping people manage their own stress response. Any questions here? Anybody before we get done today? I think this is the last slide. Oh, just know that this is in the Walsh article, that you've got access to that. Any questions about the exam tomorrow? I'm going to open up the exam here in a little bit, so you can take it anytime you would like between now and 5 o'clock tomorrow. It is 50 multiple choice items. The multiple choice items have all been shuffled, which is not as important to you taking it online, but if you're in the classroom, your number one would not be your neighbor's number one, so they're all shuffled. You can flag items and go back to them, so you don't have to take them in order. You will get your score immediately after you take the exam. Keep in mind your score is going to be out of 25, not out of 50. Because it's worth 25% of your class grade. You are not permitted to share information about any of the exam items with anybody else in the class or in the future. What do you want to know? Any questions about that before we we finish up today.
Are we meeting for class tomorrow, or that's just us doing the exam?
Just you doing the exam. And keep in mind, after you do the exam, after that, everybody is self-pacing through the course. So if you look on the syllabus, you have to take all of the other exams. I won't have the final exam up for a bit because I need to load in the final exam some items associated with the pandemic now that intro lecture has shifted, and I haven't done that yet. But you can self-pace. You've just got to take exam 2, 3, and the final exam by the deadlines. But you can take them earlier if you would like. Okay. Feel free to, if you want to meet and if you want to view your old exam and view what you missed with me, email me and I'll set up a personal Zoom meeting where we can go over that. That's a really nice way. Taking a look at what you missed and why you missed it can be very informative for your study behavior for the next exams, if that makes sense. So you kind of track it down to the origin, and that can really help you boost the way that you study for future exams. Y'all been great. Thank you for asking questions. But this is kind of ending. It's kind of sad. This is ending the live portion of this course, so it'll be self-paced and recorded from here on out. But don't let the distance from me keep you from contacting me, because if there's stuff you don't understand, you've got questions, you want to see your old exams, we can Zoom meet at any time.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions from anybody else? All right. Y'all have a great evening. The password is show me what you know, ! Each different words. Show, space, me, space, what, space, you know, !
And what is that password for?
For the exam.
I'm sorry about that. Thank you.
Yes, so show me what you know, ! is your password into the exam. And you only get one attempt and you've got 40 minutes. All right, everybody, have a great evening. Take care.